A long time ago, my wife asked me to renovate the laundry room. Alright, maybe it wasn't that long ago, but we can all agree the laundry room was a mess. If you saw part 1, then you know we added a cabinet, a drying rack, and then we added shiplap to the whole room. Now that you're all caught up, we can start with part 2. One of the biggest pain points this room had was the light. Aside from being pretty ugly, it wasn't very bright. To get to the inside, you simply have to twist off the metal cap. After that, I removed a couple of screws and then the whole assembly came down. Then I removed the metal bracket holding the light in place. Before this particular step, I made sure to shut off the power from the breaker. Since this portion involves touching electric wires, I don't want to take any risks. These little plastic caps are basically how you join two wires together. I took off the caps and started attaching the mounting bracket for the new light. In most cases, these have pretty universal sizes, so you shouldn't run into any issues. If you do decide to install a new light, it should come with instructions as to how to wire it up. For example, mine said to connect the black wire on the light to the red wire, otherwise known as the hot wire. It also said to connect the white wire to the white wire, otherwise known as the neutral wire. Once that's all done, you can tuck away the wires and then attach the light to the mounting bracket. And just like the first light, this was attached with 2 screws. I turned the power back on from the breaker, and then I tested out the light. And since this was working, I filled in the rest of the spots with Edison bulbs. I went with this light to add to the industrial theme in the room. The light looked great, so the next step was to add a shelf to the cabinet area. I measured the width and cut down a 2x6 to match that width. The depth of the shelf was going to be 2 2x6s, and these had to be the exact same size, so I lined them up on the miter saw and chopped them down. You can just measure the 2 boards and cut them to size, but very often this leads to different size boards. So I usually line them up and then cut them that way. So now we're just going to be joining the 2 boards together. The tool you see here is a doweling jig, so I'll be sure to leave a link in the description. Since I'm using dowels to join the 2 boards, that little tool just makes sure that the dowels are centered. This method is great for added strength, but it also helps with the alignment of the 2 boards. I clamped the 2 boards together and put all the dowels in their place. Once that's done, you can use this tool on the opposite end to reference the original dowel and then make the holes on the other board. Since the boards are perfectly aligned and clamped to each other, the dowel's positioning should also be perfect. I also think it's worth noting you don't necessarily need to use the dowel method to make the shelf. You can honestly just line up the 2 boards and then glue them to each other using wood glue. If you don't plan on using the dowels and you just want to use the wood glue, it would probably be a good idea to clamp the 2 boards together. Wood glue is stronger than most people think, and if you're not planning on putting anything too heavy on the shelf, you should be fine. And to support the wooden shelf, I wanted to use a few metal pipes like we did for the drying rack. Be sure to wipe them down with rubbing alcohol, just to make sure they're clean before you paint, and be careful, they're pretty sharp. I'm pretty sure I'd cut myself at this point in the video. And once that's done, we can break down the anatomy of the shelf support. So you're pretty much going to need 2 pipe flanges, 2 45-degree elbows, and then 3 3-inch pipes. And these are all 3/4 of an inch in diameter. I really like working with these pipes because the dimensions can be adjusted as needed, and as you can see, the assembly is pretty straightforward. By the time you're done, your support should look something like this, but feel free to get creative and come up with your own. And to make these pipes match with the drying rack, we're going to paint them. Once again, this is the flat soft iron Rust-Oleum metallic paint. Don't hold the spray bottle in the same place for too long, and be sure to paint these in light passes. A few layers will do the job. Really quickly, if you like what you're seeing, please take a moment to consider liking and subscribing if you want to keep seeing videos like this in the future. Thanks. To give these a layer of protection and a nice finish, we're going to use Rust-Oleum's satin clear enamel. Just like before, be sure to give it a few light passes. I had to wait for the supports to dry, so I moved back to the shelf. I had to start sanding it, which I was super excited about. I usually start off with 100 grit sandpaper, move up to 150, and end at 220. I brought the shelf back to the laundry room, and this served 2 purposes. I made sure that the shelf fit properly, but if you look closely, you'll also notice that I'm mapping out the stud locations under the shelf. I used a stud finder, and every time I found a stud, I would just leave a little dot under the shelf. Using these little dots, I drilled a pocket hole outwards, and with these pocket holes, we can add some reinforcement to the shelf on the wall. Once I was done with the pocket holes, I stained the wood using one of my favorites, Verithane's Dark Walnut Stain. If you're watching this, you probably already know this, but to stain wood, you just grab a clean rag, dip it in the stain, and then wipe that on the wood. If the wood doesn't get as dark as you wanted, you could just retry the steps and then let the stain sink in for a little bit longer. To give the shelf a protective layer, I used Verithane's water-based polyurethane. I've always found that a foam brush works best for this application, but if you have a paintbrush, that works too. I would give this anywhere from 2 to 3 coats. Once that dried, I took the shelf back to the laundry room, and now we're going to see the pocket holes in action. Keep in mind that I had pre-marked the stud locations, so this was pretty easy. This wasn't exactly the best angle, so this is what's actually going on behind the scenes. Now you can see that using the pocket holes, you can actually attach the shelf directly to the studs in the wall. Then I referenced my stud finder one more time just to find the perfect location for the shelf support. One important note here is to make sure that your shelf is level every step of the way. Once I made sure it was level, I secured the shelf support to the wall. I know I dropped the shelf support right here, but because the screw was in its place, I knew its position was secure. And here's another pro tip. While you still have some flexibility with the shelf, you can turn the pipe and secure the top screw because you won't be able to reach it later on. I made sure it was level one more time, and then I secured the shelf. Between the pocket holes and the metal pipe support, the shelf was sturdy, but I of course added the same support to the other side just for symmetry. I would try to line up your support with a stud, but I do know that the chances of symmetry are low in some cases. This means that one of your pipe flange supports might not be supported by a stud, but that's okay because the drywall is actually pretty strong. And in case you missed it the first time, you have to turn the pipe a little bit just to access the top screw. I know this isn't the best test, but this was one sturdy shelf. It didn't even budge at all when I was hitting it. We had also bought a vacuum recently, and I figured this was the perfect time to install it. I know this is a laundry room, but we also tend to keep our cleaning supplies in here. So I mounted the vacuum somewhere where it was easily accessible. As you can see, we also used some state-of-the-art cable management here. Our vacuums were the only cleaning supplies we wanted exposed. We had to get a little creative and hide the rest. I'll show you what I mean. This is a brick-styled wall panel that I bought from Home Depot, and we're basically going to use this to build a mobile wall. That way, we can hide all the other cleaning supplies right behind that mobile wall. I clamped a straight piece of oak right at the halfway point in the wall panel, and then I used a speed square to make sure that the piece of wood was set to a perfect 90 degrees. I had to cut this in half because the wall panel was actually too big to keep carrying in and out of the house, and we had to cut it down into more manageable pieces. I also made sure to do this cut with a wooden block on each end, otherwise the circular saw blade would touch the floor. And the wall panel is not going to hold itself up, so we also have to build a frame for it. I built this entirely out of 2x4s, and I used a lot of pocket holes in the process. What you see me building here is actually the base. I attached two smaller 2x4s to the base, and this is so we have somewhere to mount the wheels. I figured wheels like this would be the best option for a mobile wall. After I added the wheels, I also added the two vertical 2x4s. Then I also added another middle support just to make sure that the two vertical pieces wouldn't wiggle around. And I kind of thought this wouldn't work, but I was actually pleasantly surprised to find out that it did. If you ever plan on doing anything like this, just make sure these dimensions add up to the size of your board. That's because you're going to lay your board over it and then nail it into this frame. I used a brad nail gun just to make the process a little bit easier for me, but I'm sure regular nails work too. We wanted to make sure this was a mobile wall because, as you can see, we have some pretty important components back there. And if we wanted to service something like the water heater in the future, we would at least know we can move the wall. Notice that the top two corners fit the wall and the heating system pretty well. I just made approximate measurements and then cut those out on the table saw. But I didn't really cover them because you might not even need to do this step. Once I made sure the fit was perfect, I started painting the wall. And my goodness, I hated this color. It was a weird peanut butter type color and it looked way better at the store. I tested out a different gray paint and I also ended up painting the cabinet that same color. I thought this looked better than before, but my wife hated that color. So we compromised and, well, we went with the color she wanted. For reference, the room looked like this when we started. After another round of painting and some messy hands, the room was complete.